did take over. I'm just making sure you can see my screen. The usual question.
Yep, I can see your screen, even with my
Awesome.
very slow internet.
I'm glad to hear it. So, hi everyone. My name is Véronique Couttee, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently a endangerment fellow at the National Audubon Society based in upstate New York on the land of the Haudenosaunee. And I'm very excited to be with all of you today because it's kind of very interesting for me to be presenting about a species that I work with when I was working at the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation around 20, what year was it? Oh my God, 2016 to 2018, I believe, 2015 to 2017, sorry, that's the right year. And it's kind of great because I have current colleagues on this call, I have past colleagues, so it's kind of this overlap of my new role as a technology fellow. So I leverage technology platform, specifically GIS platform for storytelling. And it was kind of an interesting journey for me to go back on previous research and previous work that I did while I was working as a wildlife biologist with the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation and to tell that story using the current technology that I use for my work at the National Audubon. I actually extremely enjoyed that a bit too much. So I'm gonna dive in, and I use the title "A Hidden Gem of Mauritius," and I kind of feel like it's a slight bias there because I really love this bird. So I apologize for non-paradise flycatcher lovers on this call who are from Mauritius. So I will say that this is my spark bird and my gem bird of Mauritius. So that's full disclaimer. So before I go into the reintroduction effort that I was part with Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, working in Mauritius, I kind of want to set the stage for the species itself. So what does it look like, where it's from, and all the good stuff around, about why I think it's a beautiful bird. And starting with the habitat is kind of the habitat and species description. The Mauritius paradise flycatcher, also known as the mascarene paradise flycatcher, is a passerine endemic to Mauritius and is one of the 5 extant species of forest living passerine native to Mauritius, part of the Monarchidae family. And the scientific name is Terpsiphone desolata, and it's currently classified as least concern by IUCN. The male is definitely the most striking um, of the pair, and it's not fair, I guess, to the female, but the male paradise flycatcher has this dark blue, rich cap and chestnut back wing and gray breast, and it does lack the central feathers in comparison to a lot of like paradise flycatcher. But both the male and the female actually have this blue ring around the eyes that you can see, and the female on the left is actually lacks the cap, the dark blue, electric blue cap, and the juvenile is really distinguishable so because it doesn't have this light colored ring around the eye. The beak has like a different tinge of blue to it. It's like more grayish for the juvenile, and the mandible of the juvenile flycatcher is like grayish in color. So this kind of animation like really speaks for itself about the kind of habitat within which the Mauritius paradise flycatcher exists. And you can see from 92 to 2020, there's been an extreme amount of degradation of habitat, native habitat, and we currently have less than 3% of native forest in the island. And the Mauritius paradise flycatcher can be found in uplands and lowland habitats, even in those very degraded forests. And there's been a mix of reason why this habitat degradation happened: deforestation due to like agriculture, urban development, and there's been also a huge like threat from invasive species, including rats, that has been responsible for the decline of several native passerine and has accounts for the extinction of at least 9 endemic bird species on the island. So in comparison to other islands, Mauritius has lost a tremendous amount of its native forest. And so now the species that exist are kind of isolated in those pockets of forest around the island. So in 2013, the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation carried out a survey, and they gave an estimate of a range of 400 to 800 flycatchers around the island, which was an up from the 97 survey that was carried out, and free areas. There was free areas where the species were kind of observed, as you can see on the map. And the thing is, flycatchers have a higher detection rate than other species because they are so inquisitive and they're very daring birds, and they will approach people who walk through their territories. Okay, sorry about that little glitch. So in terms of their diet, flycatchers are insectivorous species, and while we were monitoring the species during the translocation relocation efforts, we took random opportunistic feeding observation, and what we mostly could observe was spiders and bugs. We didn't do any in-depth study of the diet of the flycatcher because we were not focusing on the aspect of the species ecology when we were doing the translocation. In terms of songs and calls, so I do love flycatcher because I think they are a very vocal species, and I do think they have a beautiful song. And the interesting thing is, one way to kind of attract flycatcher is to whistle, and I cannot whistle. So it was me mostly walking through the forest 99% of the time trying to whistle to attract them, but turns out you don't really need to do it all that much. They are pretty in your face when you're walking like in the forest, and they have this kind of very like shriek sound and agitated twittering and long musical like twee notes. And I will try to like not blow everyone's ear like I did Derek earlier, and kind of turn on the sound. And maybe Derek give me a thumbs up just to make sure that you can hear the male song and chatter. So in this recording, you have several like actually pairs. That was during the breeding season, and you can hear like there's a male singing in the background, and there was some like the shriek agitated twittering that I just described. And the second sound is actually a recording of the flycatcher chicks begging. So you can see very vocal birds, and that kind of vocal birds kind of goes hand in hand with their territorial behavior. So both the male and females are very territorial during the breeding season, and there seems to be more conspecific aggression between the males and the female. And I used this picture, which is actually not from the Mauritius species, but the Réunion Island species of flycatcher, but it does really exemplify what you're going to see in your face if they are like this kind of spiked hair feathers on the head and the agitated flapping around. So they are very territorial in nature, and we tried to kind of establish territories, but again, it was not a priority of what we were doing during the monitoring effort. And what we estimated from the nest data that was collected and from observation of banded bird is that the territory was about 0.5 to 1 hectare in size. And this is like a really, really rough estimate that, we didn't do any thorough checking whether or not that was true. But kind of to give you a sense, so the colored, the one that are not in gray are the nests that were for birds that actually were banded, so we could like have repeated observation, and those represent clusters of nests found for the birds. And if you zoom in closer, you can like actually see that you have the clusters for species, and it doesn't take a huge amount of space like where they have nesting attempts. So however, having said that, outside of the breeding season, from March to July, flycatchers are seen way outside of their like territory. So they do seem to stick to their territory during the breeding season, and then like establish new territories outside of their breeding season. Now, in terms of their breeding behavior, so the nest is, again, very biased opinion. I think it's a beautiful nest. It's mostly composed of small twigs, roots and lichen and spider web, and it's about 10 centimeter, and the thickness about 3 to 4 centimeter, and the actual interior of the cup is about 5 to 6 centimeter. What you do like also about the flycatcher is that there is an equal share of like labor around building the nest. So they equally share the task of nest building from the beginning. Construction usually take about 2 to 3 days. Both male and female will be seen collecting material and bring it back to the nest, shaping the nest cup by twisting movement. It's beautiful to watch. And then they will sit in the nest cup in like various positions to kind of like really like incorporate the material in the nest. And the last stage is kind of camouflaging the nest with lichens, and you then see the resulting nest on the picture on the right. So kind of the nest stages that you have is the nest building stages is 1 to 3 days, and then you will have laying usually happen on subsequent days, so on each day, so you can have up to 4 eggs in a nest. And incubation time is about 15 to 18 days, and chicks are about 14 days before they fledge. And initially in the first year, we thought that they stayed around with their parents for like just a few days, like a week or so. But on the second season of monitoring, we actually found out that they stayed with their parents for about a month after fledging, which is quite a long time. And they often stayed on the same territory as their parents. So as part of our monitoring effort, we collected a series of data around the species kind of breeding and nesting behaviors. And that included the tree species, the stage at which the nest was found. And the fledging stage was the easiest stage because the chicks was usually pretty loud when they were begging for food. So it was the stage at which we found most of actually like pairs having like juveniles, sorry. And we did find some nest at the chick stage, and we did find some early nest building. So that, and then there was a late nest building stage and some nest at incubation stage. We did also record what species the nest was found on, and most of it was on Syzygium jambus, which is actually an exotic species. And we had very little nest in native species and native trees. And that's actually just an indication of the habitat, the quality of the forest where the birds were breeding. And if you zoom into the areas that people were breeding in, um, let's just, so this is like an individual nest point. So there's several information that we collected for each nest that we found. So we collected whether or not it was a weeded or not non-weeded habitat type. We collected the tree species, the tree height, the nest height, the position in canopy, the density of the foliage, the canopy height, the canopy density, the understory density. So that's kind of a template that we replicate for a lot of the species that were being monitored by the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, is those details about the habitat quality as long as the nest characteristics. And this is about it. So I was kind of interested to look at what was the breeding success of the flycatcher in relationship to those nest characteristic. So taking the data from 2016 to 2018, there was 78 nesting attempts that were recorded, but only 28 were successful. And the overall probability was actually 95%, which is pretty high actually in comparison to olive white-eye, which is a critically endangered species of passerine in Mauritius that were found to be around 85% when research was carried out on their breeding. So that's kind of a pretty significant difference between the kind of survival probability of nesting attempt. And I kind of was interested to look further into this in terms of the nest characteristic. So what I ended up doing is I apply a logistic regression model to that data, and I wanted to see what the nest success was like in relationship to, firstly, nest height, secondly, species of tree, thirdly, foliage density. And what I actually found out, first of all, is that my sample size was very small and quite limiting, especially for like species of tree, because as we've seen in the previous dashboard, is that most species were in like syzygium, so that didn't provide enough comparison in each different species to be able to find any pattern into species of tree. Same for foliage density. It seems that the sample size was pretty small. However, what I did find is that there was a significant correlation between nest height and nest success nest success, like successful nests were less than 6 meters above the ground usually. And one like possible reason for that is predators such as like rats and mynas usually tend to be higher up in the canopy. And from observations, the flycatcher's nest would tend to be on very, very like thin, like undergrowth, like understory trees. And I think that kind of highlights a lot of the importance of understory habitats management and ecosystem management into kind of creating the ideal habitat for the flycatcher, because several of the passerine species in Mauritius are in this critically or endangered status because of how they interact with predators, how they nest, and all these factors really play a huge role in determining whether or not the nesting attempts are successful ultimately. So that was something really interesting that I really like kind of enjoyed digging into that part of the science and looking about why potentially that could be. And completely anecdotal, non-scientific story is one day I was doing a nest observation, and I had a nest of a flycatcher that was about one 1.5 meter off the ground. If not, it was very, very close to the ground. And I'm sitting there, and suddenly, like, you have this gigantic rat who runs past the nest under it, followed by a cat, because we also have feral cats in the forest. And I did more motion in that moment than the flycatcher, and like the bird stayed completely stoic on the nest, which is a very interesting response to such daunting and big predators just running under your nest. Unlike olive white-eye, who as soon as there are predators in nearby or near their nest, like they will literally like freak out and go on alarm side mode. So given that they can't really do much against the predator, I do wonder if it tends to attract attention to the nest rather than being beneficial to have this alarm instinctive fight or flight response. I do feel like flycatchers tend to go into neither flight nor fight. I would say they would just goes pretty quiet and camouflage in how they interact with their nesting and breeding attempts, especially when they are sitting on the nest and incubating. Or they're just really good at poker face. That's probably what it came down to. So that was kind of setting the stage about the species itself. Why do I think it's an amazing bird? It's beautiful and it's kind of territorial in breeding behavior. And the reason I kind of gave all this context is because all this plays a huge role in the decision that we ended up making when we were going through the reintroduction program. So first of all, if you do Google Mauritius paradise flycatcher, you will probably find mascarene paradise flycatcher. And there's a reason for that, is because there has not been an official reclassification yet. But in 2013, Rachel Bristol, who was my mentor and person that I work on the field in Mauritius, kind of initiated was doing her research work on flycatcher, and what she did find out from collecting blood sample from Mauritius, Réunion Islands, Seychelles, is that the Mauritius paradise, the Mauritius subspecies that was considered a subspecies of the species in Réunion Island, mascarene paradise flycatcher, has significant divergence from the Réunion Island species to be considered an evolutionary significant unit that would require management. So, long complicated sentence that I was getting muddled up myself. And bottom line is we found that it required attention of its own. Even though it was originally considered a subspecies, it was an evolutionary significant unit that required management. So with the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation and partners, we initiated the goal of the project was to contribute to the conservation of the Mauritius paradise flycatcher by increasing their range and numbers by reestablishing a self-sustaining population in a new area. So what does that look like on a map? What does that look like on a map is what we did is we have ongoing monitoring and conservation efforts of several species actually in the Black River National Park. What we did is we decided to translocate and reintroduce species on the eastern mountain range, and specifically in the Vallée de Ferney, which is in Grand Port, where the species had been previously previously existed and was deemed to be locally extinct. So the reason we went for reintroduction is because it would give us the ability to put it simply, not put all our eggs in one basket, because we did have pockets of flycatchers up northeast. We have some other areas that have the species, but we really wanted to increase the range of where the species could be found. So our source population was actually Combo, and this is where one of our field station is currently based. And for people that are currently still working at Mauritian Wildlife are aware, this field station is no longer a thing, and it's a big update. This is no longer the field station. So what we did decide is to translocate species from Combo for one very reason, is that was the biggest subpopulation that we had on the island, and so we believe it to offer the highest genetic diversity as well as the least risk of being affected by harvesting. And the release site was actually choose to be Ferney Valley. And so the Vallée de Ferney was chosen for a couple of reasons. And so prior to doing the reintroduction, we did a couple of habitat suitability and habitat assessment to determine what was the best site that had the best tree density, the best, the most suitable canopy cover, height and secondary and tertiary branching, foliage density, but also the highest insectivorous count. And another reason that Ferney Valley was chosen is because it had the quality of the forest was increasing, and it was under active restoration efforts. So now into the timeline of the translocation itself. So the initial time frame was actually August to end of March. So that corresponded to the main breeding season of the bird. And the translocation would be over a 2-year period. So initially, what we wanted to do was to capture a large batch of flycatchers and then translocate about 30 of them. But because it's conservation and it has its challenges, and we don't act alone, we have to make sure that we're doing things according to protocol. We have to make sure that we have all the required permits. We got delayed, if I'm not mistaken, up until October or November, when we could finally do our first translocation. And I don't know if I'll ever wake up that early in my life again, but we did wake up brutally early. It was around like 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. sometime when we started, because we had to set up the mistnet at like 5:30 a.m. And that's probably why I don't wake up anymore early. I think I've had my fair share of waking up early, so it's really hard for me to wake up early unless I'm going mistnetting or birding. And so what we'd set up the mistet and start catching birds as soon as, there's some like sunlight. And the advantage of a really early start is that the net that you can see is barely visible when it's still like dawn, and my back is turned. It's probably for the best, because I probably look awfully sleepy in that picture. And what we would do is we would usually carry on until about lunchtime, like, or before then. I think we played it a lot by ear because we didn't want it to be too hot. So we were kind of very flexible about the conditions. What we prioritized was like having the best condition for translocating a bird. That was kind of the priority that we tried to set on. And then we would catch the bird in the mist net, and then we would ring them and extract them from the mist net first. Ring, sex, aged, take morphometric data, and blood was taken also. On some species, we did attach a radio transmitter. So we wanted to understand, we had like a couple of radio transmitters that we had managed to get on a grant, and we wanted to understand the dispersal movement of the bird and kind of understand like how do they move once we've like translocated them. And each transmitter was assigned a channel before being like glued onto the back of the birds. And I can tell you, it's the most nerve-wracking things that I've like done in my life is glue something on a bird. I don't know how the bird felt about that, but we made sure that we had the right kind of glue, that the protocol was followed, because it's something fairly common, but it's still something that was a new experience for me, and I had to learn and practice on other species before I actually glued it on a flycatcher to make sure that it doesn't come off. For the actual transfer, what we did is we placed the box in cardboard boxes that had perching in it and aeration holes. And as long as we were catching bird, we would keep the bird in a cool and quiet, shady places until they were transferred. Once the bird was captured, then we would drive to the release side as smoothly and quietly as possible into the zone that we had chosen where we'd release all the bird. And it was close to a stream because the stream had like highest insectivorous and had no kestrel boxes nearby, which was something very important. Um, and then he's on the call. He does know why we don't want his kestrel near kind of flycatcher release sites. So what we ended up doing is that we kind of release them, and when we were release them, we would give them like rehydration fluid before we release them, because that had been a fair amount of stress. And what we ended up like doing is, if there was any radio tracking to be done, like we would like follow them the same day, or first thing in the morning the next day, or we would like translocate more birds. So for the 2 years, we translocated 35 birds. And you're going to say this is very anticlimactic, because I'm going to say there's still no evidence that the species has successfully established a viable population in the new area but there has been incidental sightings in Fernie Valley since the project ended. And kind of one of the challenge of this is, and I will go back to the map, kind of one of the challenge is that we have also the Domaine de l'Étoile, which is adjacent to the Vallée du Fernet, and Domaine Ylang, where so we cannot stop the bird from flying over fences, but we were not necessarily capable of monitoring full on in those other sites. We did get permission to go to Domaine de l'Étoile at some point to radio track to see if we could get any signal. And one of the challenge we face is we did have a couple of birds fly back, because Mauritius is such a small island that that kind of range is nothing for a bird. So we did have pairs that flew back to their sites. And another challenge of the project is we couldn't just grab any birds, because we ended up doing the translocation during the breeding season. So we had to make sure that they were not sitting on a nest, that they didn't have any juveniles dependent to them. And so there was a lot of like monitoring that needed to happen. We couldn't just grab birds and translocate them. So that kind of took time to kind of set the stage to be able to smoothly translocate, and made it that we didn't translocate as much birds as we intended originally. Now, why do I think it's the gem of the Mauritius forest? Again, I think I chose the title because the flycatcher is definitely my spark bird, and it's definitely a bird that I can associate a lot to. Um, and I can associate a lot to it simply because it's very chatty like me. It's colorful and very inquisitive. So I really feel like I can associate to the species, and I just think it's a beautiful bird. But there are stronger needs of like, there are more research need for the species, but not just for the species, but also the ecosystem of Mauritius. And I chose this map actually because, let me zoom into tiny, tiny Mauritius, like if I can find it in the Indian Ocean. Like, Mauritius is one of those islands that have tremendous potential, because in terms of social progress index, we're quite high. And there is an incredible capacity of talented individuals in Mauritius that work in conservation, Mauritian, and we've had a lot of local um, expertise grow in the years. But there is something that is cruelly, we need more, we still need more inclusive and equitable conservation practices in the country, because we do need the scientists, we do need the policymakers, but we need other people on board, people that will tell the stories, people that are children. And for me, I didn't know a lot of these, like the kestrel, the flycatcher, the all these species. I didn't know they existed. I live on such a small island. I had no idea those species existed until I was 23. And I grew up in an area that had no access to quality forest, to good quality forest. So access to healthy outdoor spaces was not a thing. And I don't want, and I know there's a lot of local groups and people who are now understanding this and working with communities to increase access to education, but we also need to work toward bringing um, toward creating habitat corridors. And that's what I said: habitat restoration and ecosystem based management and nature corridors as three things, because we need to understand that like those isolated pockets of nature are very important, but they need to be an integrant part of community's life by creating pockets of healthy forests where community lives, so that they can take a vested interest in the conservation but get easy access to outdoor spaces to understand its importance. And I used to think that local people didn't care, and now I realize you can't care about something you don't know, that doesn't exist. And that's, for me, is the bottom line of the struggles that exist for those species. Is a lot of people still don't know they exist, and given a chance, flycatchers, olive white-eye kestrel, they could become the spark bird of many children or grown-ups or senior citizens. So we need to make the space more inclusive. And kind of a more scientific approach to the research need is one way to kind of understand whether or not a successful population has established there would be to do a passerine survey, an island one passerine survey, but instead of just driving it from the science perspective, driving it from a community perspective, and have this community science crowdsourced data that can use to back up the conservation efforts, and have also a grid server deployed, which was already something happening at the Mauritian Wildlife, is having a grid survey happening in to monitor the species like occurrence. So that's kind of all I've got for you all. And I want to thank you all for listening to me reminiscing my time as a wildlife biologist. I haven't been on the field for since 2018, so it's been a long time. I do miss it tremendously, but now I kind of do the more technology side of thing a bit. I'm a bit like Derek. I do still go out birding, but I do love the technology aspect of it, and especially the storytelling community perspective and how you leverage it to tell those stories in an engaging way. Um, and I do want us to stay connected. So that's my link tree where you can find uh, things about me that I will post in the chat. Like, I will post this link in the chat, and I do want to thank Derek for like letting me present today. I thoroughly enjoy going back onto this research that I used to do and kind of putting the story map together. This is something I've been meaning to do for a long time and never had time to do. So this was like a perfect excuse for me to build this tool on the weekend. And so I just really enjoyed that. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And thank you everyone for listening. And I see we have some questions in the chat. Let me see the question.
Yeah, so I'll I'll let you go and pick the questions from the chat if you like. Otherwise, I can read them out.
Yeah, I'll just read them in order of like what I see. The first question. So the first question is there enough forest on Îles Aigrettes to relocate flycatcher there as well? So we already have quite like an abundance of species of especially the Mauritian fody on Îles Aigrettes. I wouldn't be able to speak whether or not like it's a matter of forest. It's more a matter of like availability of food. And for the translocation, we chose a hard release technique, which is something quite new for the Mauritian wildlife because we've mostly done like soft release where we had an aviary and we didn't do supplementary feeding. So we needed streams and we needed spaces that high abundance of like insects so that the species could be just released and didn't have to be kept in an aviary and supplementary fed during the time of the translocation. So I cannot answer yes or no about the amount of forest because I haven't looked at the data for like a couple of years now, but we didn't choose Îles Aigrettes because there's already quite a high abundance of Mauritian fody, and some of the reason why I don't think the island was the first choice. There's no stream, so I don't think there's necessarily the appropriate habitat for flycatchers to kind of breed in and like have enough insects to um, kind of sustain themselves on the island. Um, I do want to check with Brian if that answers your question. Maybe a thumbs up from you. If I can find you. Yeah. So I will take that for yes. um, so Allison asks is if there is awesome. I got a hands up from Brian. So Allison asked if is there a eradication program in Mauritius or in problem areas? And yes, there are. Um, most of these areas that we talk about, like Combo, Ferney has trapping grids, but as you can imagine, eradicating rats is a very, very difficult task. So the only successful eradication of rats and shrews, not shrews, rats, sorry, was on Île aux Écrêtes because it's an islet. But every other areas, because of, again, we are dealing with fragmented habitats, we created trapping grids that was meant to not eradicate, but meant for controlling and keeping the rat population on a low enough level so that species would have a higher chance of successful breeding in those spaces. And I hope that answers your question, Alison. I'm not sure where you are, so I'm just gonna, okay, I see you, and I hope that answers your question. You can give a thumbs up or post more question in the chat if you feel like it doesn't answer your question. Last question is from Elizabeth. So why did you not catch them during the non-breeding season? That was the intended plan, Elizabeth. But what happened is we ran into conservation issues of getting permits in the right time. And by the time we had the permit and our funding was on a 2-year span, it was never a straightforward process because there are steps to be followed, and unfortunately the birds didn't wait for us and they started breeding. So that was, yes, the initial plan, but because we had to do this project within the time frame, we still decided to carry forward with the translocation, but that significantly reduced the amount of birds that we could catch and translocate. And we had to do this prior check of whether or not the species were sitting on an egg or breeding, or whether they had juveniles, whether they had independent juveniles. We did end up catching and translocating some amount of juvenile birds that were independent juveniles, so they were no longer dependent to their parents. So yeah, I would say that it was a day by day decision making situation, and when we were in doubt, we often had to release the bird because their territories were so small that we often would put in the mistet, but we had a decoy and a sound to attract them also. So we would just sometimes have to not take the bird because we were not completely sure. So yeah, it was very much making decision on the spots about whether or not we could translocate the birds.
So can I ask a question?
Of course.
I'm looking at the world and I see that you're not that far away from Reunion. Is this bird on Reunion as well?
Correct. So initially, it's still named the masquerade paradise flycatcher Terpsiphone bourbonensis desolata, and the Mauritius species was considered to be a subspecies of the Réunion Island species, but genetic research find there was genetic evidence that they were an evolutionary significant unit from the Réunion Island species, which then sparked the interest of considering them as this unit of species that we needed to manage on its own, rather than thinking, oh, well, it's okay because they're also on Réunion Island. It doesn't matter if there's not as much or if it's not managed. So yeah, definitely very close genetic lineage there. And Réunion Islands has also a higher like habitat, native habitat percentage than us, with 30%, I believe, something like that or more. So kind of on this note, that's why the project was launched.
Any idea how long ago they separated?
I would not want to speak to that because I don't have this in my head. I think I'd have to go back to reading the paper
Yeah,
to speak to that.
no worries. Um, I think that's the end of the questions. So I think it just remains for us to say thanks very much, Vero, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I apologize if you're hearing my generator in the background here. We have no electricity tonight, so I'm running off of a petrol powered generator. And so I'm glad that we made it through, because I was worried it was going to switch off. And so thanks very much again. A really great presentation, and I really appreciate you coming to Learn the Birds to tell us about your story. And so hopefully some of you who are here tonight for the first time, we will see you again on Learn the Birds in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, Derek, thank you for letting me present today. I really enjoyed that. And I posted my link tree for anyone who wants to connect with me about birds, or just, connect with me. Please feel free to use my link tree. It has my LinkedIn profile on it, and I really enjoyed this. So thank you for letting me present today.
Oh, thank you. And good night, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. We'll see you again soon.
Bye.